So many of us may doodle when we're sitting in a class or a meeting or something that requires us to be somewhat attentive, but we tend to fill in our time listening with these little scribbles in the margins of our notes or something like that. Or maybe you're on a phone call and you're just keeping down some notes and filling in the margins with some pictures. Maybe they're abstract, maybe they're not. And I don't know if this has happened to students, but when I was younger, if I was doodling in a notebook, a teacher might be accusing me of not paying attention. Now, there have been several studies done that sort of try to challenge this idea that doodling draws our attention away from a primary task. Here are some examples of doodles I've made in recent years at meetings or during phone calls. And I don't hide my doodling when I'm in a meeting. I actually, if anyone wants to challenge me on it, I'll just recall what was said. Try to be careful about that, of course. All right. So the main question behind the study is: does doodling draw our attention away from a primary task? And this was conducted by Jackie Andrade in 2009. She's an associate head of psychology at Plymouth University in the UK, and she used a lab study to give us data about if it enhances our attention or distracts from our attention. Uh, when you do two things at once, which is very common nowadays in the 21st century, we like to multitask. We might label this as concurrent cognitive tasks. What makes doodling special, or this study special, is that it's not just looking at concurrent cognitive tasks, but cognitive tasks that have different uh, modes. For example, you're not doing two things that are visual or two things that are auditory. You're doing one thing that's visual and one thing that's auditory. So, for example, if we were playing a video game on our cell phone while watching a movie, those would be concurrent cognitive tasks that both require visual attention. But in this case, we're doing something that's both visual and auditory. So if we do two things at once, will there be some sort of internal competition in your brain to see which one gets primary attention? And it is believed that if there is internal competition, there will be some sort of decrease in output or in the efficacy of what you're doing. But what if this is not always true? Can one task that you're doing give aid to another task? And this is really one of the key questions of the study. So let's get into the procedure. All right, we always like to start with the participants. And here we have 40, which is a very nice number to divide evenly between a control group and a doodling group. The 40 people were members of a medical research council. And if you look here, you can see that the age range is quite uh, large. So 18 to 55 years old. So that will help us later when we talk about things like generalizability. These 40 people were actually volunteering to do a different study, but they were asked to stay for a second study. So this is one of those things that could cause some confusion, even for people who write the textbooks. I think in one or two textbooks they call this a self-selecting sample, but because they were asked to stay after another study, we're actually going to call this an opportunity sampling. Because they happen to be there. Would you mind staying another few minutes to do this short research with us? Okay, so they were divided again very evenly, 20-20. What is not even, as is typical with a lot of modern psychology experiments, is the gender ratio. In the doodling, 17 female, and in the 20 control, 18 female. So as was true in studies like the Laney study, there is a huge gender difference in the ratio. Okay. That's even true for psychology class in general. I'm not sure if this is true for everyone's psychology classes, but in mine, women tend to out rank men in terms of numbers. So I even did a demographic study on the YouTube videos I've been posting, and sure enough, the majority of viewers are indeed female. All right, so this is a lab study. We're going to have several apparatuses that are well controlled, and one apparatus is the uh, voice recording of a very monotone phone message. The key word here is monotone. We want to make sure that this task is boring. It doesn't excite any of the listeners. And this will also be important for our evaluation later when we talk about things like mundane realism. I mean, the word mundane and monotone kind of go hand in hand, both having to do with something that is boring or typical. All right. I'm sure many of your lectures that you hear in school might be monotone, one tone, not very dynamic. All right, so it was a 2.5 minute recording. I think it was rather fastly spoken. I mean, 227 words per minute seems to be rather quick to me. Played at a comfortable listening volume. That's a little subjective. I'm not sure exactly what comfortable listening volume would exactly mean, but I guess that just means that not jarring and not hard to hear. This was done again with an audio tape, some old school technology, which is kind of surprising considering the study was done in 2009. They didn't use like an MP3 recording or something like that. Now there are 8 names of people attending a party, and also 8 names of places which were mentioned. And these will both be quizzed unknowingly. I mean, some suspected there would be a quiz on memory later on because they are part of a research council, and I'm sure they could figure out there is some perhaps deception there. And also there were some decoys or some red herrings. 3 people that were not going to the party, and even a cat named Ben, if you want that level of detail, who could not attend the party. Not much of a party if there's no cat, I would guess. The cat is always the highlight of the party. All right, let's go into Apparatus 2, and that would be the piece of paper in which they wrote down the relevant information, or the information they thought would be relevant. Now, half the participants, these are the ones in the doodling condition, were given a special piece of paper, where the people in the control group were given a very typical piece of paper, one with like lined paper or something like that. And this is A4 paper, and if you're not British, that's like what, 8 by 11 paper, like typical printer size paper. And there were 10 shapes per row, alternating between circles and squares. Actually, it's just squares and circles if you want to keep that in the right order. And there was a wide margin to the left where they would put the relevant or target information. Now, the ones in the doodling group were told to shade in the shapes, all right, which is sort of like doodling. It's not how we usually doodle, but I've given, plenty of handouts to students, and I watched them color in various things that weren't meant to be colored in as they're waiting for the next task or something like that. So it's not terribly unrealistic to do this as a doodling task, but it's not quite what we think of when we think of doodling. And the reason for this is that we want to make sure that doodling is somewhat controlled. So let's get to the actual more detail about the voice recording. And as they listen to the voice recording, it's a long piece of text, and you could find that in the original source material or some of the textbooks. And there were, like I said earlier, 8 names that were monitored. This is the monitored information, the names that are in green: Jane, William, Claire, Craig, Susie, Jenny, Phil, and Tony, where there were 3 people who were not going to the party, so those were considered to be false alarms. And there was, detail in the results about how many people flagged the false alarm and how many people, got the target information. So that's called the monitored information. The other information that was later quizzed is called the incidental information, and that happens to be the surrounding context that was not monitored for. And that's why they're in a smaller font here in this graphic. There were 8 places, all in the UK: London, Penzance, Gloucester, Colchester, Harlow, Ely, I'm not sure, Peterborough, and Edinburgh. And again, that's called incidental information. So again, we're trying to see if they're able to retain things, not just that were monitored, but things that happen to surround the monitored information. So getting into a little bit more detail about the mock phone call or phone message, the transcript had the names in bold. All right, you can see some examples here with Jane, William, and Claire. The incidental places were placed in italics. London, Penzance, what else is here? Just in that example, there are 2 in italics, I believe. Keep in mind that there were exceptions for plausible mishearings of names. We did this with some students a couple of days ago, and one student was confused if it was Greg or Craig, which is a very easy mistake to make. However, if you made a mistake that was quote-unquote plausible, it was accepted as a genuine memory of a name. All right. Keep in mind that the people in this study were from the UK, so they're likely to know the majority of these places. Some are more obvious than others, more famous than others. Others, for example, Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, which is not pictured here, London, Gloucester. These places are quite famous. Now, we don't really talk much about counterbalancing much in the studies we've done so far. I know in the old syllabus there were more sophisticated versions of counterbalancing. All counterbalancing means is that you're changing the order of tasks to control for fatigue effects or order effects or practice effects. So in each group, there was a reversal of which quiz you took first. So for example, if I was in the control group, I would do, half of us would do party goers first, the names of the people who are going to the party, and then we do the places second. And then for the other half, we just reverse that. There are more sophisticated versions of counterbalancing if there are more tasks involved. So for example, if there are 4 tasks, you have so many permutations that you could do A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, C, D, B. This is much, much simpler than previous studies that we've looked at in psychology. So please be familiar with the term counterbalancing, and the benefit of it is that it controls for order effects such as the fatigue effect. All right, and that's really the whole study. I mean, I feel kind of guilty this video is going to be shorter than the other ones, but I really find this one to be not just straightforward, but also straightforward and interesting in that it actually applies to something that happens to us every day. We're always involved in mundane tasks such as listening. All right, so let's just jump right into the results. Usually we don't have students memorize large pieces of data, but I think in this case, these pieces of data are relatively easy to know. Now, if you look at the original source material here, they show you the breakdown for the incidental information, which is the places, and the monitored information, which is the names. And you could take it upon yourself to know those differences and perhaps those standard deviations in parentheses if you want to. I have a feeling that with the first year of this study being on the syllabus, I would be very surprised if an exam wanted you to know these things individually. So let's look at the overall data, which I think is more memorable. The doodlers recalled a mean of 7.5 pieces of information. That's regardless of whether it's monitored or incidental information, so whether it's names of people or names of places. However, the control group recalled a mean of 5.8 pieces of information, and that looks significant without doing any sort of mathematical p-value kind of stuff, and indeed it was concluded to be a significant difference. Okay. It should be noted that some people, like I said earlier, were suspicious that this was a memory test, and they even removed the data of people who were suspicious just to see if the differences were still significant, and then they put it back in, and they concluded it doesn't make a difference or not whether they were attentive to the fact that this was possibly a memory test. All right, so take a moment, pause that if you'd like. Again, I think the overall data of 7.5 versus 5.8 is easy enough to memorize, and then after the exam in May, you could just let it fall out of your head if you'd like. But the main conclusion of this study is something that I hope you would keep, and that is that doodling is not harmful. In fact, it might be helpful for memorization or auditory tasks. I'm not sure if you're going to need to know this, but we might as well throw it up here anyway. There was no requirement for them to fill in a certain number of boxes. All they were told is shade in some of the shapes. And there's a wide variety of what they did. You can see here, some people colored in 3, some people did as much as 110. That's quite a lot. And if you take all those values together, it comes out to a mean of about 36 shapes overall. So a wide variety of responses. And here it says one participant did not doodle. I guess that person wasn't being attentive to the instructions, or maybe is just, wants to be contrarian or defiant. But one participant did not doodle. So that person's data was eventually replaced by somebody who did doodle. So, and they also made sure that the people who had the lined paper did not doodle as well, because that would, mess up some of the results. It wouldn't be controlled then. All right, and here again it reiterates that some people suspected a memory test. So let's get to the overall conclusions. All right, The first one is sort of easy, and this is a quote. Participants who performed a shape shading task concentrated better on a mock telephone message than participants who listened to the message with no concurrent task. All right, so that's a pretty easy one that conforms with the results. The second conclusion is a little harder to get out of the results. The reason behind the better recall is not clear. So, what is the cognitive mechanism that leads to better memorization? How does a visual task like doodling help us with a different task? So, to quote the study, what mechanism might underlie the effect of doodling on concentration? That is not yet known. So, we do have correlations, but we don't have any sort of cause and effect quite yet. Okay, so remember, correlation is not always cause and effect. All right, so I feel, again, this is a very simple study relative to other studies we've done. So we might have to just make it complex on our own by making sure we evaluate it. And I have a feeling that this will be a great paper 2 type of study to deal with, because you could, do variations on the study and improve it in some way, maybe for its generalizability and things like this. So the obvious problem with the doodling task that I initially had, and it was reported by the writer Jackie Andrade, is that they were not asked to doodle freely. When we are sitting in class and doodling, we're not doing it in a conformatory way. We're not doing it in boxes or in circles. We're doing it free form. So because they were not asked to doodle freely, they may not have the spontaneous quality that we have when we doodle. Okay, so it's not natural doodling. It's very controlled doodling. Controls are always good in a lab study. Makes it easy to replicate. Also gets rid of some extraneous variables and things like this. So you have to sacrifice one thing to get another thing. And that's why here on the GRAVE chart, I have validity as somewhat middle. Now, I'm not putting it at low for the validity, especially with ecological validity, because they were indeed giving a boring task. And like I said earlier, many of us in our daily lives, whether it be meetings or classes, are faced with a boring monitoring task, things that we'll be asked to do and maybe assessed on later. Also keep in mind that they did another study beforehand, and they might have been excessively bored because this was the second thing they were asked to do that day. So they might have been a little tired, they might have been a little inattentive, and that helps with the mundane realism of the study. In a weird way, fatigue might be a good thing here because we do want the task to be boring. That makes it more challenging to retain the information. Okay, so this is a unique study in that fatigue might be a bonus rather than a negative. Getting to the other evaluative elements, generalizability. Now you may say to yourself, well, I never heard of Gloucester, I never heard of Harlow, I don't live in England, whatever, so this will not be generalizable to me. But keep in mind that this was the target population, or I'm sorry, the population that was chosen to take part in this study need to know where these places are, or maybe how to spell them. It would be unfair to give them maybe places in Pakistan or something like this. All right, so I don't really have a problem with the generalizability in terms of the places that were used. The problem with the generalizability is that these people are part of a research council. So there might be a similar level of interest in psychology, or a similar educational background, or a similar intellectual background. And the other thing, of course, is the gender balance. People have accused women of having better memories than men. Maybe that's true. I know that's often the case when people ask, what were you wearing on your first anniversary, and the wife knows and the husband doesn't, whatever. All right, so reliability. It's a lab study. It's well controlled. The same number of boxes are on each paper, 4.5 inches in the margin, 20 people in each group. It seems to be very, very well controlled. The recording is always the same. Somebody didn't read the message live. That would have led to maybe different results for different people. So they heard the same recording in the same way. So the apparatuses make this well controlled. The application, like we said many times in this video, is very good because we do have to engage in things that require auditory attention. Namely, all of us go to school, or are legally responsible to go to school. So I'm going to put the application as somewhat high. And the ethics, of course, deception is necessary. It's not a bad deception. We need it to get the study done. So it's quite high. I'm sure people didn't walk out of here traumatized. Oh my God, they made me shade in some boxes. So again, this is my personal evaluation. If you want to disagree with it, put the arrows higher, put them lower. You're welcome to do so. But keep in mind that the author, Jackie Andrade, did say that the validity might be hampered by the fact that it was not natural doodling. All right, so why do I think this might be good for a paper too is because it invites us to make the study better. When Jackie Andrade says it's not naturalistic doodling, could we open it up to say, hey, instead of coloring these boxes, you just draw anything that comes to mind? And one thing, when I doodle, I usually don't doodle abstract things. Things like circles and squares are somewhat abstract. I usually like to draw things that are resembling things in reality. So would it be interesting to have maybe one group be a control, one group be a abstract doodling, and one be more of a non-abstract doodling of real objects or things that are recognizable? So keep that in mind. Don't be too deceived by the simple nature of the study. You might be asked to improve it or add some variables that were not there in the first place. But one of the best studies in the unit or in the new syllabus, I believe, simply because I think it applies to the lives of students more than perhaps things like eating asparagus or I don't know, what's one that doesn't apply directly maybe? Button Boy, the one who's terribly fearful of buttons. So I hope you enjoyed this study, and I hope you enjoyed this video. All right, bye-bye.